In this lecture, we'll be discussing poverty and wealth, both globally as well as with particular examples from the United States. We'll also be exploring some of the responses to income as well as wealth inequality in the United States, particularly the Occupy movement and the Billionaires for movement. So overall, what I'd like you to think about over the course of the lecture is how is poverty exactly defined? And at the same time, how is wealth defined? And is there such a thing as too much wealth, too much prosperity? And if so, if there is indeed too much wealth, how might we begin to address this inequality between prosperity, wealth, and poverty? And again, at what level should intervention occur? I'll begin with a history of economic thought, looking at PreSmith ideas, and of course Adam Smith with Wealth of Nations in 1776 really forms the bedrock for a lot of our understanding of the economy today. We'll have a little bit of a discussion of Karl Marx's work as well as Max Weber's work. I'll talk about income inequality and debt, particularly in the United States, and then some of the responses to income inequality and debt in terms of the social movements, including the Occupy movement overall. So pre-Smith, you have Aristotle, Plato, and St. Thomas Aquinas all weighing in on different ideas about wealth and value and how it should be provided. Typically, agriculture, for many of these early theorists, is seen as the source of wealth in that it provides necessities. So here we're talking very much about sustenance and subsistence. The economy has historically been associated with a social unit or the household, and there have been numerous calls over time to bring the economy into line or put one's house in order. With the economy and with money as a whole, individuals must exercise both prudence and wisdom. As the love of money is seen as the root of all evil, money is essentially seen as excrement, as the most evil thing possible. On the other hand, production for use value is legitimate, and also classical and traditional societies were built on hierarchy or intrinsic differences, that humans were not all equal, but they were all in fact children of God. And we also see from St. Thomas Aquinas, issues of distribution and exchange must be regulated by concepts of justice overall. Adam Smith is probably the most famous of theorists regarding the economy overall. In 1776, his book, An Inquiry into the Wealth and into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, sometimes referred to as the Wealth of Nations, was as much a compilation of earlier theorists as well as a codification of capitalism and understanding of capitalism that would later be reflected and critiqued in many other scholars, both in economics and economic anthropology. Adam Smith pioneered political economy in terms of the relationship between the political state and the economy as a bedrock or key concept in understanding that they are truly embedded with one another. Smith was a utilitarian, and utilitarians as general looked at the greatest good for the greatest number. Smith was interested in the moral implications of the capitalist system. He believed that capitalism would in fact have negative impacts. However, the benefits of the capitalist system and market economy would outweigh the cost overall, hence tying into the notion that, in fact, this was the most rational and beneficial thing to do for the greatest number of people. Smith's notion of the invisible hand of the market, that the market itself would transform selfish ambitions of individuals into the greatest good for all of humanity. And indeed, although Ayn Rand, in the excerpts from her interview in All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, talks about one of her only influences being Aristotle. Her sole intellectual depth is to Aristotle. We can see here clearly that Rand mirrors much of Smith's early thought about the notion of the invisible hand, and indeed the idea that selfish ambition of the individuals would ultimately lead to the greatest utilitarian benefit for all. And it's interesting to note politically how the spectrum was drawn early on in terms of conservatives and liberals, because they've had very much different ideas, and these have transformed over time. And so liberals at the time would follow Smith's advice about markets and about the free market, leading to the greatest utilitarian benefit for all. Whereas conservatives during Smith's time were those that relied on a heavy hand of regulation on commerce as a whole. Adam Smith's work today in The Wealth of Nations is often referred to as neoclassical economics. As mentioned earlier, Smith drew from many other scholars in his work, and indeed The Wealth of Nations was a compilation of the work of many early theorists of economics. Amongst these was Francis Kinsey, and his work on the treatise on the Tableau Économique, he looked at the physiocrats, and the physiocrats believed in the rule of nature, and that indeed the source of all wealth within society was going back to agriculture, and that the economic system is a system in which things flow, and the flow of income and goods as a whole created a consistent system overall. So the physiocrats were, again, the key emphasis here is on nature and natural wealth and the soil, and things, individuals like artisans did not in fact create any real wealth at all. This was very much critiqued later by Karl Marx amongst others. John Locke is known for his two treatises on government, and he his work was about the ideology of individualism that is linked to the material world, and that human nature allowed men to be selfish, but generally they acted in a reasonable and tolerant manner to one another. He is most noted for his development of the social contract, following Hobbesian's notion from Leviathan, where society essentially exists for the beneficence of its population as a whole. That is, individuals will cede some rights for the overall responsibility of the state to ensure other rights to the population as a whole. Locke also was responsible for the labor theory of value, that the value of goods fundamentally tied into the amount of labor embodied in the particular object. Another individual that influenced Adam Smith's work was Bernard de Mandeville, and in 1705 he published The Grumbling Hive, or Knaves Turned Honest. And this was a poem wherein a beehive was essentially used as a mirror for human society as a whole, and that everyone was looking out essentially for number one. So this idea of selfish individualism as a whole of Mandeville. And it's quite it's quite a piece. I think it's a fairly quick read to go ahead and go through some of the key parts of it, and it's quite enlightening about. So it's really a social commentary on the times as a whole. In opposition historically to Adam Smith has been Karl Marx, and indeed many of Karl Marx's writings, he enters into these quote-unquote conversations with Adam Smith. Marx is known for not only the Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1847, but his book Capital, which is a critique of the political economy, Adam Smith's notion in 1867. Marx's key focus was on class and ownership of the means of production, and he saw labor as a key concept overall. He believed fundamentally in an evolutionary perspective where capitalism would come first to provide the material, the structural, infrastructural support for communism to occur. And he believed that it was inevitable that capitalism would fall due to the deep contradictions in capitalism that would cause it to fail. The first of these was a growing divide between the owners and the workers in terms of who owned the means of production. Second, there was a continual crisis of profits for owners. The workers were only paid the minimum needed, and this was done in order to reduce labor costs per unit, as the owners were constantly competing with one another over relatively limited markets overall. And so the idea was to reduce costs, and try to get as much work out of each person as possible by paying as little in terms of labor. Workers were also driven to levels of subsistence, according to Marx, and this was primarily due to displacement by machines. And so workers weren't able to effectively organize together with one another because of the transition over to machinery and its resultant displacement of human labor as a whole. Marx also believed that greater solidarity and class consciousness would emerge amongst workers, and that workers would eventually realize their common condition contra notions of economic of segmentation along the lines of race and ethnicity or other markers of social inequality as a whole. Max Weber also entered into conversations with both Marx as well as Adam Smith. And in Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in 1905, he talks about the idea, the march essentially towards production and wealth accumulation as an end in itself, and that one would be seen in the grace of God or the divine because they had in fact accumulated wealth. And so it wasn't in the spending of wealth or ostentatious display of the Calvinists overall in the Protestant Reformation, but rather it was the idea that individuals could procure massive quantities of wealth over time. His piece on Economy and Society, Class Status and Party in 1922, he insists that individual identity is not subsumed by class identity, so contra Marx. So Marx believed that, Marx relied essentially too heavily on economics and dialectical conflict between forces of production, relations of production, as the motor driving social evolution. But Weber saw more than that. He looked at the focus of ownership on property as the constitutive element of class as a whole. So these theorists overall form our understanding of economics and indeed how it's proper to behave in society as a whole in terms of wealth and the relative distribution of wealth. Smith argues for essentially an invisible hand where the market will essentially allow for individuals to act in their own self-interests, and in doing so, with every individual acting in their self-interests, we will, as a society, be able to progress. And the utilitarian benefits would be realized to all within society. Greatest good for the greatest number. Marx, on the other hand, saw a fundamental conflict that would eventually, due to these four deep contradictions in capitalism, that would eventually blow up. And Max Weber was not entirely sure that this would happen over time, that segmentation of the workforce would continue. And indeed, segmentation of labor was something that Karl Marx was intimately concerned with. And if you read through the manifesto of the Communist Party, you can see clearly how labor is divided, how labor movements were divided during Marx's time as well. So what are the ramifications of these different theorists today? Well, today in the globe we can see some fairly gross disparities in terms of both income and well-being. And this figure here comes from Scott Sereno's book, Global Problems, The Search for Equity, Peace, and Sustainability. And this figure in particular comes from the United Nations Human Development Report, which looks at countries and essentially ranks them in relation to one another, looking at things like life expectancy, Human Development Index, mean years of schooling, and the gross national income, which is adjusted for living, which is essentially purchasing power parity in individual countries. And so you can see, according to this document here, you have very high developed countries, highly developed in terms of human development, all the way down to low in terms of human development overall, where you see the resultant disparity between not only quality of life in terms of, if you tie money directly to that, in terms of purchasing power, but also things like overall education and schooling, and in fact life expectancy as a whole. You see pretty dramatic differences between life expectancy, for example, in the United States compared to countries like Congo or Ethiopia, for example. And indeed, you can compare this with the overall